Hi, I'm Urmi, editor at Move Smartly, and this is a Move Smartly show. Our episode today is my conversation with Canadian journalist Gregor Craigie. Gregor has just released his latest book, Our Crumbling Foundation: How We Solve Canada's Housing Crisis. Gregor is a longstanding journalist who has worked with the BBC World Service, CBC in Canada, amongst other outlets. Gregor has also previously written on public policy, including On Borrowed Time, North America's Next Big Quake, which was a finalist for both the Basili Prize in Public Policy and the Victoria City Book Prize, and was a Globe and Mail Top 100 book in 2021. His newest book on housing is no exception, and it's also climbing the Globe and Mail's bestseller list. I really enjoyed both the book and my conversation with Gregor, and I hope you will too. As always, if you find our show useful, please share, subscribe, and comment, and leave us a positive rating from whatever platform you're accessing us from. Thank you for watching, listening, and for your support, as always. And now, on to the show. Great. So I am pleased to be talking today to Gregor Craigie, journalist at the CBC. Hi, Gregor.
Hi, Urmi. Nice to see you.
And we are talking about Gregor's fantastic new book, Our Crumbling Foundation. Gregor, first of all, congratulations on this amazing book. The subtitle is How We Solve Canada's Housing Crisis. I must say, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I mean, I did have to put it down sometimes because I got depressed, but that's not your fault.
Well, thank you, Urmi. I appreciate it. And I know I felt the same way writing it. There's so many times I thought, oh, how did this happen? How did we get here?
So just to talk about the strengths of your book, you paint these beautiful portraits, I call them, of people across the country actually living out our housing crisis. So, whether that's a young family in BC who has to, after living there their whole lives, move to Calgary to find the home they can afford, to people living their lives in RV trailers in another part of BC. And then we see Montreal, which has such a high level of tourism, but also the highest amount of renters, not only in Canada, but North America, seeing, the risks of the Airbnb effect, where renters are being run evicted out of their suites. And then, of course, to the Toronto area, where we see in Brampton, many homeowners, I think many recent Canadians, falling into financial disarray as they got caught up in, home buying amidst one of Canada's historical interest rate cycles. So you paint these beautifully, but I must stress to everybody, the amount of facts and research you have in every story is amazing.
Thank you. That's good to hear. I'm glad it was convincing, because I took a lot of time talking to people and confirming details and so on. But I mean, to your point about having a hard time carrying on with some of it, I have to say, Ermi, it was depressingly easy to find people living these situations. I mean, when I started, because I've been reporting on it for years, when I started writing the book, part of me wondered, oh, geez, I'm not sure if I'll find just the right person in that situation. Somebody with a mortgage they're going under, working two books, or somebody who's living in an RV, or And I briefly doubted myself before, once I had started the book and before doing all the research. And it just, I mean, it was person after person. The difficulty was paring it down and deciding who to write about and who not to write about, because so many people are living this across the country.
That is amazing, but also incredibly sad, but unfortunately understandable. Now, is that what interested you, Gregor, in this problem? You're, as I said, a longstanding journalist. You've written other books, I believe, on our, the upcoming risk of earthquakes in Canada. But what made you write about housing right now?
Well, I had been covering it for basically a quarter century, ever since I became a journalist in Vancouver 25 years before I started. So 27, 28 years ago. I moved as a student from Calgary to Vancouver, and instantly housing, the cost of rent, or whether you'd ever be able to buy housing, was an issue. And so it always was percolating in the background. But it was, it was realizing, I think it was the January 2022. I'd been pondering this, worried about this, but I ripped open the BC assessment, property assessment we get here, and my house, which you can see behind me, which I'm fortunate enough to own. I'm a journalist. I make a very middle class salary. My wife's a teacher, and we just squeezed into the housing market with the cheapest house in the city of Vancouver in 2004. Now we live in Victoria, and I opened the assessment, and like a lot of people's assessment during the pandemic, it had soared, and it was now $1.3 million, and it's since gone up in the last 3 years to 1.5. And for a very brief moment, Urmi, I thought, hey, I'm rich. But then I just thought, what? No way. What are my kids going to do? And I had been hearing every day from some of my young colleagues who were like paying more in rent for not great rentals than I was paying for mortgage on an old house, but still a secure house. And so it was basically a reaction to feeling that it was out of control, which I think it has been. The right of raise the rate of price rises over recent years, and just what is I don't want to be too pessimistic, but what it sometimes felt like the whole next generation is doomed, and many renters. So maybe doomed is too strong a word. I think if we address this as a country, it's not. But it just felt unfair and like a human crisis ultimately. And I thought to wrap my head around this, even if only for me, I need to write a book about this.
Yeah, I mean, as a fellow Canadian, I feel your sense of real alarm that a way of life that we're really proud of and proud to welcome so many to is crumbling. I think you've
Yeah.
named your book very well. I do also want to say that everyone in the housing industry should be reading this. If you're a Canadian citizen, any Canadian resident, new or long residing here, should read this. And I'm thinking maybe a GoFundMe so we can just hire readers to read it out of a bullhorn at every, politician's office right
I like the
outside.
way you're thinking. Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that.
So again, highly recommend it. I now want to also mention that there are some hopeful parts of this book. You look at some success stories from around the world, and so we learn a lot about Tokyo and Paris's successful infill stories of infill supply expansion. Building up into already existing neighborhoods, not necessarily building out to new areas that need to be serviced. We hear about the co-op experience in Berlin, which is very
Mhm.
interesting because co-ops are starting to make a little bit of a ripple in Toronto. And we actually used to have co-ops in Toronto. So
Yeah.
I think that's a form of housing we're not as familiar with, but should be. And then you have some other examples across the world, too many to mention here, Helsinki's housing first approach. So again, so amazing. Did you visit all of the cities you wrote about in the book?
No, I visited all of them except Helsinki, which I'm still really. I have a Finnish friend too. It's like, how can you not go to Helsinki? Well, because I was on a tight deadline, and this was so. And the one I'm really even more embarrassed to admit is I haven't been to Tokyo, but I've been everywhere else. New York, Singapore, into parts of Mexico, where else? Paris, London, and a lot of different cities where they're doing things differently. And also with the quick caveat that not all of these places have solved the housing crisis. Because if anyone has been to London or has British friends or relatives, they'll know that they're having a huge affordability crisis there. But I was looking at specific measures in different places, like in the UK, like their key worker or essential worker housing program. So all that to say, I would love to still get to Finland, but haven't been there yet.
Well, it's amazing that you did get to all those places. That's my only criticism of the book, maybe for the reissue, is more photos, please, of all the
Yes.
projects that you describe. You have some great photos of some of them, but every single project you were talking about, I was sort of trying to visualize. But we have
Yeah.
Google, so that's not
I
all.
know.
That's
Well,
not all
and
your
you're
responsibility.
well, no, that's fair though, but you're not, and I think that's one of the ones that publishers are grappling with because we ask ourselves that, and Urmi, I've heard that from other people as well. I wanted more photos, and I think publishers are saying, well, people inevitably are going to Google. So, but I take the point because I mean things like, and we have one photo of it, but I mean you could have a full multi-photo, multi-page display of 3D printers for housing. I mean that's another one, and that may hold a future especially in developing countries, but also here in Canada, for the rapid construction of many new homes is, the idea of printing, say, a two-bedroom home in 24 hours with this giant 3D printer, which is basically looks like it's got two tracks running beside the foundation, and then these two towers that go back and forth. They almost look like giant server towers in an IT room or a computer room at work. And then the railing across, and then the printer head, which looks like a giant soft serve ice cream outlet. And instead of ice cream, it's pouring cement. So it just adds 1 inch at a time, but it goes on this pre-programmed route around printing all the walls and everything. Meanwhile, the construction team is two people monitoring this with iPads. They're constantly checking the conditions of the cement mix based on temperature and humidity and that kind of thing. But it's low labor and very quick. And so something like 3D printing could offer a real future in a number of parts of the world, including Canada. They're starting to use it in the US, Habitat for Humanity, especially because it's cost effective, quick, and safe. And that one, I mean, never mind photos. That's worth a video in and of itself. So I do think a lot of people will be reading the book and doing a lot of Googling as they go along.
Actually, you've helped me visualize that even better.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah, that was great. Maybe they'll just need to call you. But no, that actually leads me to what I was wondering about what stories alarmed you the most. Let's start with Canada. And then let's talk about what made you feel a little bit hopeful. What struck you the most out of the world stories and then back in Canada?
Well, the thing that alarms me the most is I do think this is going to, and I don't like saying this, but I think it's actually very likely going to get worse over the next few years before it gets better. And I'm not really a pessimistic person. I'm an optimistic person. But you just look at the number of the overall stock of aging rental infrastructure in this country. You look at our population projections. The last couple of years, we've been tops among G7 and OECD nations in population growth due to immigration. And I'm not for a second going to argue against immigration as the child of immigrants and knowing what a success it's been for Canada. But just to say that our population projections are going to keep going at a race that arguably outpaces construction. So I think this is going to get worse for the next few years. And that brings me to what really makes me worry is that so many solutions are actually often in the short term going to provide or going to present other problems. And I'll give you an example of affordable rental stock. Let's say, like in Victoria, where I live, a 3-story rental apartment building that's full of 60-somethings who have worked their entire lives and just retired, and they're on CPP payments, but they're paying rents that have only been going up a couple of percent due to rent control over the last 20 years, and they're going to face eviction. And even if it's done well by a public agency or or a co-op that's been approved or a new affordable housing unit, often people are in situations where they may actually lose their housing or at least their level of affordability to make way for more housing. So maybe that 3-story apartment makes way for 6 or 12 or 18-story, and ultimately over the course of a couple of years, you get a lot more housing in the end. But sometimes the growth is going to be incredibly painful, and I'm seeing this. I mean, I see more and more seniors here. I certainly see it in Vancouver, and when I was in Toronto, and then in the Maritimes, I've talked to a number of seniors who are living in their cars. They're sleeping in Walmarts. It's just so sad. And the ones who are in RVs, like some I talked to in the Cowichan Valley here on Vancouver Island, consider themselves lucky when they talk to their friends who are maybe living in a Bronco or an old minivan or what have you, and as I say, sleeping in a minivan or in a Walmart parking lot. So I am worried that it is going to get worse. But what fills me with hope is that there really are tangible solutions, and as you said, ones that I've covered from around the world. I mean, the co-op housing movement, briefly, is something we had in this country, and we largely forgot about it. And of course, people in co-op housing didn't forget, but as a country, we forgot. 40 years ago, we essentially pressed pause on it. And if you look at Germany, it has basically 10 times the per capita rate of people who live in co-op housing. And so, of course, a co-op housing, you have security, you have a great sense of community as well, and that you know your neighbors, and you have to do a bit of work to take part in it. But when housing prices are going through the roof, property prices and rents and so on, people in co-op housing have an amazing sense of stability, and we already have it here in Canada. So governments and communities and individuals coming together can with a bit of government support, come together and create a lot more co-op housing. And I hope what you said, Urmi, about Toronto just accelerates, because co-op housing is really a good tool. And sometimes you could have employers or even community groups or unions coming together to create co-op housing. Another possibility is expanded leasehold, like they do in Singapore. And there is the big caveat that, Singapore is a very different place. The city state that's been dominated by one party ever since it's independent from the British has a lot of things Canada probably doesn't want to copy, such as the fact that their generous home buying restrictions are restricted in most part to heterosexual couples, and others can't apply. So, for instance, if you're not married, you don't have access to the same home buying, or if you're a same-sex couple, you don't have access to the same benefits. But if you look at Singapore's mandatory savings, it's a bit like our CPP, but they have this fund called the Central Provident Fund, where every employee has to donate 20% to this fund. Singapore homebuyers can use that as a down payment, and they have a 90% home ownership rate, where people own their apartment, but they don't own the land. And I think leasehold could be, it's used in very small quantities in Canada. That could be expanded. And then we could follow Paris's example, as you mentioned, where they have it led to a dramatic increase in infill housing. They haven't built out over their green belt in Ile-de-France, the Paris region, basically by the national government and then regional government saying all the municipalities need to meet a benchmark of 25 and then 30% affordable housing. So that's basically just been a stick. There's carrots as well. They can get financial rewards for meeting the targets and so on. But they're showing in Paris that you can build an awful lot more housing, and it's not just government building it, by the way. Of course, that's a big issue, and happy to talk about that if you want, whether it should be a private response or a public response to the housing crisis. More and more people I'm talking to in this country say, yeah, yes, and yes, it should be both. This is not only for government, but that doesn't mean government doesn't have a role or that we don't need more public housing in this country. So Paris, I think, has proven that both governments, with strict government expectations for more affordable housing, both government and industry can respond and build a lot more housing in metro areas like Toronto, the GTA, that we think, some people might think have been built up or built out. Maybe that's not the case, especially if you look at Paris as an example, and many other examples, Urmi. I really think the potential is there if the country gets its mind around to it, and I think we're starting to do that. I think things will be better, a lot better in another few decades, but I do think it's going to be slow progress, as anyone who's ever built a house or done a major renovation knows.
Yes, it certainly feels like we're starting so far back in the race, but I do agree with you. We've seen, and you note, landmark zoning changes now in the Toronto area, across cities in Canada. BC is a great example of that, even applying at the provincial level to allow or sort of end this reign of the single family home, which has been very important to the, I guess, the thinking of Canadian communities. Now, I want to say for a while, there was a time that this wasn't there, but different social changes in Canada meant that, at least since the big wars, there's been this emphasis on, building that single family home community, that dream. And we've seen that across Canada, but unfortunately, that has been used as a reason not to allow more building. So when we say infill, we mean not only co-locating, for example, rental housing that might be for different income groups, but also allowing market-priced fourplexes or sixplexes on properties that were once zoned for single homes. We see that now changing. But I have a question for you. When I read through the examples in Paris, in Tokyo, in Berlin, all very inspiring, I kept writing down the square footage of the units to make sure I was getting them right. I read one in Paris that was 333 square feet. I read about a family in Paris, another one, mom, dad, two teenage daughters, I think in an 800 square foot apartment, but 200 of that was a balcony. Right?
Well, there was 860 and plus a balcony. Yeah.
Okay, it was plus. Okay.
Yeah, but no, but I'm not arguing with you. It's tight, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. And again, in some of these other areas. Now, I'm not, and this is what I want to say. I'm not on one side or the other of the argument, but I do wonder if shrinking space, let's say we do manage to solve some of this problem by putting families in the sky or in condos and higher buildings, or at the very least in 10-story rental buildings, or perhaps even smaller sixplexes and fourplexes. Is that part of the Canadian dream and this anger that we feel built up around it when it comes to housing? There's pricing is one, not being able to live where you want to is another. But is square footage not part of it? Even if we
It is.
succeeded here, it's just not the dream of that hockey rink in the backyard or so forth.
So the short answer is yes. And so, hypocrisy alert, I'm talking to you from a single family home, and I'm lucky to have it. But I do think, and I know I heard from a number of housing experts and analysts and people who said, we Canadians maybe need to give up on the dream of the white picket fence. But it's interesting. I mean, I used to live in London, Urmi, 25 years ago, granted, but I grew up in Alberta in a giant sprawling house. I don't know, 3 or 4 thousand square feet, and everybody had their own bedroom and practically their own bathroom. I mean, like a lot of Canadians, especially in suburban Canada. And so when I moved into London as a young single guy and moved in with a bunch of Australians into this very skinny terrace house or row house, I thought, how? And actually, I have family in Scotland. I've visited them many times, but I was struggling to think, how do so many families live like this? Well, this was my mindset when I went in. But actually, after a few months, I was completely used to it. And there were 3 bedrooms, and there were 2 bathrooms, and there was a little garden out back, and there was space to park a car on the front end. All that to say that you don't have to live in a tower. We don't all have to move into 40-story condos, but a bit more density and flexibility in our neighborhoods, as you mentioned, will make a huge difference. I mean, I also profiled Portland, Oregon, where they're a bit ahead of Toronto and BC municipalities in abandoning exclusive single family zoning. So you've got a lot of young families moving in. And I talked to one company in particular, Oregon Homeworks, where they made a great living for decades in Portland. They had a pretty straightforward model. And they would buy property in established Portland neighborhoods, like old, nice neighborhoods, tree-lined streets, and so on, with little tiny bungalows, tear them down, and usually, almost always for a doctor, lawyer, maybe an engineer, they'd build very nice 2,500 to 3,000 square foot single family homes. So when Portland and then the state of Oregon and then the city of Portland allowed 4 plexes statewide and then 6 plexes in the city of Oregon, if half of them were affordable, the company Oregon Homeworks said, okay, we've just got to go with this. And they started building 4 plexes and also cottage clusters. So you've got 4 separate, anywhere between 900 and 1,200 square foot homes that are 2 bedrooms. And you're right, they are smaller. But what was so interesting, I talked to the owner, Eric Thompson. He said, it feels so good. He said, I was really leery about this at the start, but he said, now all of a sudden I'm selling to middle class young families. And in Portland, we don't necessarily have the same affordability in some Canadian cities, but they were selling for about 500,000 American. And he said, all of a sudden, I've got a restaurant manager married to a teacher, and they can afford it. I've got a police officer married to a nurse. They can afford it, and they're okay with the smaller size. So why shouldn't that be an option in neighborhoods? A 4-plex instead of a single family home? Because if I had the money and I wanted to go down to City Hall and replace this single family home with a brand new single family home that was, say, 3,500 square feet, I could literally do it. You just get a building permit. It's as easy as that. If I wanted to a few years ago, it's just changing in BC, but if I wanted to replace this with the same square footage, 4-bedroom or a 4-plex home, I mean, it would be years, and people have spent years trying to get neighborhood approval, rezoning, all that kind of thing. So the argument has been, why shouldn't it be just as easy to add modest density? And I think in a lot of our neighborhoods, that's what we're going to see, because it doesn't mean an end or a ban on single family homes. It means that other types of homes, gentle density is allowable. And one of the critiques of that has been people saying, but that's not going to solve the housing crisis, because you'll have 4 in Victoria, you'll have 4 townhome units or units in a 4-plex, and they'll all be 900,000, or maybe they'll be 1.1 million. So how does that solve the housing crisis? And in and of itself, it doesn't. And that's what people in Oregon have told me, including a housing analyst who looked at the numbers, and he said, we have to look at the nuance here. This doesn't solve the housing crisis on its own. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because there's a lot of middle class buyers who want these mid-sized homes at an attainable price, not affordable, but attainable. And he said, and it was adding hundreds of homes, new homes a year, above and beyond their rate of growth in Portland. So it's making a difference. but it's one of only dozens of things that will make a difference. But back to your original question, Urmi, about size, I think a lot of us are going to have to accept that we're not going to have such big houses. But as one of my kids said to me, he said, well, we can't keep this house clean in every corner anyway, and we never go down to the basement anyway. So I'd probably be okay with just a modest sized 3-bedroom townhome. I know that's not going to satisfy everybody, but I've met a lot of people who are worried about getting evicted who would be thrilled to have a stable housing, a stable townhouse that they knew they could rely on, or a 2-bedroom apartment. And so I think maybe for Canada, the solution might be somewhere between what some countries are settling on, tiny home wise, and what we've all grown up with over the last few decades.
Yeah, I mean, and you're not wrong. I mean, that monster McMansion in the suburbs, a similar experience. The funniest thing is my immigrant parents also said that one of their happiest times is when they first settled in Toronto and were helping 2 other couples. So they lived, in a small townhouse all together.
Interesting. Yeah.
They said in hindsight, that was one of their happiest times. And yet, as soon as they were able to, it was really important to go out to that bigger house. And this idea of securing your children or, that backyard. And then I agree with you that the attitudes of their offspring, all of my siblings, is very different. And we're living in much smaller footprint. So it's possible. I guess the question, in time will tell, is how much of this is going to be a Canada-wide solution. But, like, I do think it's particular to, let's say, a particular urban dweller or, a certain personality type. But let's see. But I now want to talk about the flip side of this. So on the one hand, we have, okay, maybe this succeeds and we don't accept the form. I'm now worried about something in it from the Toronto perspective, and I think we're seeing it across Canada, where as we are embarking in these zoning changes, the financial aspects of building right now are at their worst. So we have a historic interest rate hike cycle that we're in the middle of. We have costs of construction skyrocketing through COVID and not coming quite back down. We've always had an ongoing labor issue, which is weird in the midst of one of Canada's, I think, if not biggest population booms. It's got to be up there. We still can't seem to get more labor employees for construction. These issues continue, but mostly above everything is the demand has fallen by a lot. So a lot of what was spurring our construction for a very long time was not just the end user, but those investors. So a lot of that's coming out of the market just as we're opening up zoning. Now in Toronto, they allowed laneway housing. So those, or they call them granny cottages, a couple years ago. And the small amount of housing that has been built is being noted upon. So what I'm a little bit nervous about is it possible that some of these zoning and building booms in Tokyo and Paris either happen during better financial circumstances, or what I suspect in the case of at least Paris and Berlin, and maybe Tokyo too, is that government stepped in with funding? Because my concern here in Canada is people might associate this as a failure if in 3 or 4 years we don't see a lot of density taken up.
I think that's a great point, and I think you're right. With interest rates so high and construction costs, I think that's probably what's going to happen, and it's one of the many reasons why this is such a confounding problem. I mean, there's so many different aspects to this, and then throw in over the last couple of years this rapid rise in interest rates that's scuppered so many people. And I've talked to builders here in British Columbia who've said the same thing. They've said, you know what, this project penciled out with whatever 10% affordable housing as well 2 years ago. Now we've seen the interest rates go up, and actually that's been one of the criticism of a couple of the builders I've talked to. They said, why on earth didn't CMHC and the federal government at least have a low interest guarantee for builders who were meeting a certain affordability threshold? And that was not the case. After interest rate rise after rise after rise. So I think a lot of countries show that public housing has a really key role to play here. I mean, that's certainly been the case in Paris. And I really do mean this. It's not only public housing, because they've had a lot of incentives to private builders as they've expanded the Paris regional metro and rapid transit system. They've freed up public lands for new hubs and so on. And they've made significant commercial possibilities available for private developers to go hand in hand with private house building and a lot of public housing construction. But to your point, I mean, that's arguably when you do need more public housing construction. And don't forget that Canada, especially after the Second World War, we built a ton of this stuff. I mean, if you go back and look at the housing starts, I think, now forgive me if I'm wrong, someone's going to Google this and I might be off by a year or a few thousand, but I'm pretty sure we peaked in around 1976 when the population of the country was just barely over half of what it is now. We were building housing left, right, and center, and a lot of that was public housing. And so a lot of us grew up in a Canada that had been backstopped. Let's say it had had its foundation reinforced with a healthy stock of public housing. And again, I know a lot of people are opposed to that, just as a lot of people are opposed to any kind of economic or financial or market forces being in the housing stock. But it's worth a lot of us remembering that a much more stable housing market we grew up in was a mix of private and public. And so I think there's a strong argument with the conditions that you just mentioned, Urmi, there, that says we need significant public housing and infrastructure and investment over the next, I don't know, decade or whatever it is. It'll depend. And as you also said, a lot of this is community dependent. I mean, I was hesitant in the book to say, well, rent control is always the solution. I mean, I think in some places where it's really low vacancy rate and people are getting evicted left, right, and center, it's clearly an important step, but is it always the case? I mean, it can also, in a different market, in a different community, turn around and be a disincentive to the construction of housing. So these things are all very specific, but I think to your point about costs and interest rates and new projects starting to slow down, I think there's a strong argument that yes, public housing is going to be incredibly important in this. And I've heard, as I say, from a lot of people, boards of trade, business owners, chambers of commerce, as well as social housing activists. So we're seeing, I think, a lot more agreement on the stereotypical left and right, if you will, on some of these issues when it comes to public and private being the solution together.
That leads me, I was trained as a comparative scientist, so it's all too easy to say, well, that's Paris. I mean, I was struck by the example of the Louis Vuitton luxury group redeveloping, as you told the story so well, this mall that's a UNESCO World Heritage Mall. I mean,
L'Est Américain, yeah.
First of all, you're not in Toronto when. Secondly, they redevelop it into another gorgeous shopping mall. But the government then says you can only do this if you get 93 social housing units or some number like that on top of it. Now, that also struck me. Some of them were those 300 square feet condos. But I thought, wow, imagine like developers are already annoyed at some of the things they have to do. And then I saw that the housing commissioner of of Paris came from the Communist Party of
yes.
Yeah, so again, that underscores there always be cultural differences, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't make the examples any less important. Now, one thing you just spoke to about rent control, maybe it works here, maybe not there. I bet we can say that about a lot of the things you're talking about. What are the right limits for infill? How many units are right for a certain area versus another? That just goes back to the adage that real estate is super, super local. Right? So housing, every solution would have to be. But I'm wondering, in your list of fixes, which you did have a great list of fixes in your book, I'm wondering about one thing. There seem to be a lot of supply side ideas. On the demand side, if there's one big macro thing we could do that doesn't require as much regional probably calibration is, should the federal government be thinking about our immigration numbers, at least in the short term? Because it seems to me that genie has exploded so far out of the bottle now. It has poured just so much fuel onto what was a problem is now a crisis. And to be fair, we're all I too am a child of immigrants, so I do understand, how can you get through the door and then shut it on someone behind you? I think most Canadians don't think that's right. But the truth is they're coming in, and newer Canadians are the ones being unhoused or poorly housed. And then, those who are already here are already poorly housed. So it's terrible to invite people in and then say, hey, go live under a bridge or your car. And we're very smug in Canada. For a very long time, we've been very smug that nobody sleeps in a car in Walmart parking lot. That's maybe south of the border. But your book shows that that's not true. So I'm wondering what you think about immigration specifically, our our popularity is almost part of our problem.
Yeah, but I think this is squarely on the government. And let me just please be so clear, this is not the fault of immigrants. I mean, I just spoke a couple of months ago to an incredibly articulate young man from Bangalore who was working at the 7-Eleven right near my office, and we were chatting about this. And he said, you know, and he wasn't rude or being dismissive or being emotionally knee jerk. He just said, I honestly am really disappointed in Canada that we came in good faith, and the opportunities, and he said it's largely because of housing, because he pays so much and he's squeezed in with friends. I mean, this isn't like a guy who's, well, I had to have a 2-bedroom apartment to myself. He's living in a big house, squeezed in with, more than half a dozen people. And he said, I am disappointed that Canada appears to have managed this poorly. And I think that's what it comes down to, or me personally, because, Canada has been if one of the great success stories of Canada has been immigration. This country has been just such a land of opportunity for so many people from so many countries around the world, and it can continue to be so if it's well managed. But it really worries me when I hear people start to say, "Well, it's because there's too many immigrants." Now, the number of the level of population growth, which is due primarily to immigration, is a factor, and it's not healthy to deny that or ignore that. But we also have to be careful. I know I'm not explaining this to you, Urmi. I'm just like, in case any viewers want to go and make the extrapolation that this is immigrants' fault, because it's not, because they've come here in good faith. It is up to the government of Canada, working with the provinces and cities, to make sure, just as if we were throwing a big party at our house, that we're well stocked for the number of people we're inviting in. Because I mean, we could all agree in a country of 40 million people, we wouldn't have an immigration level of, and I'm being ridiculous on purpose, we wouldn't say, let's have 40 million people move to this country next year. We couldn't do it. And we used to have about 250,000 coming every year, and that seemed to be manageable, roughly speaking. So the government needs to be very careful about how it plans this. And to that point, I've talked to both the Premier of BC, David Eby, and the Housing Minister, Ravi Kahlon, and they've been pretty pointed in this, and they've been saying to this, and they're not against immigration, but they've been saying to their federal counterparts, the Prime Minister and the Federal Housing Minister, you need to plan this carefully. And one of the specific of many measures the BC Housing Ministry has asked of the Federal Housing Ministry is, please tie the construction, or rather the funding of public housing projects to the immigration numbers, and have them go in lockstep up and down with them. So that's not an argument against immigration. It's just saying, for goodness sake, we need to plan this. And as I say, Canada has been a success story for so many immigrants. I wrote about the CEO of CIBC in the book, and he mentioned when his father immigrated from the former Yugoslavia. He was Croatian in the mid 60s. And I just did a quick, very simplistic breakdown of average income at the time for family versus average cost of a house then versus now. And I think it was 3-to-1 at the time versus, depending where you are in the country, 7-to-1 on a national average. And in Toronto and Vancouver, it's going to be way more than 7-to-1. So that right there is diminished opportunity for newcomers who want to come to this country and build this country and build a new life for themselves. So we need to much better manage it. And that may, in fact, to get finally specifically to your question, that may mean fewer immigrants. I don't claim to know, and I don't specify in the book whether that should be less, more, what have you, but it has to be carefully managed number of intakes of new Canadians or temporary foreign workers with a management and an analysis of where the housing supply is going.
Indeed. And one of your most poignant stories, the Tokyo example, where you encountered all these Toronto and Vancouver expats who, while they were paying very low rents, were able to purchase for a very low amount of money, and of course, enjoying the celebrated design and food lifestyle of Tokyo. You ended that section with this lament that they missed the multicultural nature of Toronto and Vancouver, exactly. Almost all of them. It is really, really sad to think that what our success is predicated on through mismanagement of this equation of the, especially the housing and immigration number, could sully that and make people angry about what has been something that Canadians are by and large very proud of, which is our diversity. So I think that we finally, I don't know if this was your experience, ours was blogging from the private sector. There seemed to be, what do we want to call it, a taboo about saying
Mhm.
this, even
Yeah.
several years ago. And now that that wall's been broken, unfortunately, has so much been done that we need to think about a moratorium. But, like you said, that's something that I think people are going to start to think about. And that kind of leads me to my sort of final observation. Your list of recommendations is great, and it is very in line with lists that I've seen from other really well-educated panels. For example, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada and England, has chaired a panel that released another sustainable housing report for Canada, and it championed a lot of the same initiatives that you mentioned. My only concern is that all political parties in Canada seem to be releasing their own
Yes.
multi-part, 10 prong, 15 prong, plans. And I wonder if we're allowing them to get away with a bit of a lack of focus. And what I mean by this is by saying, okay, we're going to throw a little bit at this initiative and this, a lot that don't require money. I would note a note here,
Mhm.
rather than taking a strong position and a long, a really longer term play on a few major things. I wonder, are we letting them get away with kind of choosing what's expedient, none of it being synced up? And we risk in 5 years from now, no change in our numbers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that, and I'm not going to be partisan, both because of my day job, but also I genuinely hope that everybody, well, both in their next provincial elections, because we've got one coming up here in about 6 months in BC, and federal elections, who care about housing will ask their specific candidates, essentially the question you posed very, very nicely there. What specifically are you going to do? Don't throw out a long list of platitudes, but let's have some specific focuses. And I do think that successive governments of various parties have dropped the ball on this federally and provincially. And I'm only going to pick on for 30 seconds here the current federal Liberal government because I covered this and I interviewed Justin Trudeau in person in the 2015 campaign and asked him, and as I've asked many other people, and there were very specific pledges on housing that frankly have not come true. So we need to not only have specific ideas from each party about what they're going to do, but then have a commitment as Canadians, and that goes for everybody, the media and housing advocates and industry people and everybody, to hold them to account continually as it goes through. But I think you're right there. It's too easy to throw out platitudes, and I would ask specifically a number of questions, such as how are you going to? I mean, for me, the big questions are how are you? What specific things is your measures is your government going to take to increase housing supply overall? What specific measures is your government going to take to increase affordable housing? Because if it's just a question of supply, then I think it's going to take a few decades before the needy, vulnerable, homeless, or marginally housed people are taken care of. And if that matters to you, I would ask the candidate and the party, what specific measures are you going to have in terms of increasing supply overall and looking after the most vulnerable who need affordable housing now. So those would be my questions, and it's going to be a tough one. But don't let people off the hook. There's no single simple solution. Well, we'll just cut red tape. That's what we're going to do. We're going to just reduce taxes. I'm not saying those aren't important components of it, but you need to hear more specifics, whether it's federally, provincially, or at the municipal level as well. This is also a question for our city councilors and aldermen and mayors.
Yes, I mean, I'm going to wait out here on a ledge, but if I had to pick my big three, do what a politician would want to do, I
Yeah.
might pick right now because we're in an absolute crisis. The house is on fire. I
Mhm.
think I might pick immigration targets, really looking hard at that, even if a moratorium, not a never, just hang on, something's gone wrong here. Or some kind of leveling of the numbers for a bit, like a reduction, we should say. My second would be probably expanding something like the CMHC's low cost loans to developers for different segments of the market. Because I really do think, especially with a focus on affordable, but even I've noticed that in Paris and Berlin, they do focus on that tranche of workers, like really essential people
Yeah.
in our society who are just not able to get the market price, but are not going to qualify, nurses, doctors. You wrote a really shocking stat of how our own national forces, armed forces, cannot even
Yeah.
rent in Ottawa, which is
Yeah.
just absolutely mind-boggling. So that might be my second pick. And the third, I think a public, a public house building fund that is massive between feds
Yeah.
and provinces to just build some of this stuff itself. So to put you on the spot, do you have a big three that you might pick?
Let's say I'm with you on the public housing for sure. I mean, my difficulty, Urmi, is, and I take your point because from when you're assessing candidates and parties, you do not actually want to get them let them get away with to some extent what I've done in this book, because I've got a list of repairs, and I think it's over 3 dozen. And I firmly believe that all of these are necessary. Again, not in every single municipality or province, but all of them are needed at least somewhere in Canada. So my difficulty is paring it down. But yes, the construction of public housing, I think that would be incredibly beneficial. Those loans you talk about, CMHC preferential loans for the private construction of more affordable housing, absolutely. I think it's important that red tape be reduced in municipalities. That's typically for the provincial government. So let me put that. I might have a separate list of 3 provincially and federally. And the immigration one, I absolutely think, and here I'm going to waffle because the devil really is in the details. I'll just say absolutely categorically, I don't think we should have a moratorium on immigration in Canada. I don't think we should pause because, and this is a very personal thing, but I don't think we want to do that in Canada lest it be repeated or set a precedent. But reducing the numbers would be fair. It's gone up and down over the years. It would be fair, and with specifically the intent and reducing while at the same time committing to a formula and a massive increase in public and private housing goals and quotas. And if you want to follow France's example, either a national government or a provincial government can set, actually, as British Columbia has done in the last year of most of the bigger municipalities, it set quotas. So places like Victoria, Vancouver, suburbs like Burnaby, Oak Bay, Saanich, they have quotas on how much affordable housing they can build. So that may be part of the solution. But I like all of the suggestions. My difficulty is paring it down to only 3 because this is such a big crisis, decades in the making, that there is no one single one. But if I had one, see, it's funny, I can have a long list or one. If I had absolutely one, I would say the construction of more public housing. And lest any of your viewers say, typical lefty, you know what? As I mentioned, chambers of commerce, I've talked to so many business owners, boards of trade, and various people who I would have thought 10 or 20 years ago wouldn't have said that. They've said, we have to do this. We just have to do this. It's almost like roads and hospitals and infrastructures at this point. There's a certain segment of society that can no longer afford market rentals. We have to look after them. And in many cases, they're working in the businesses who are advocating for this. And I think if I had to pick one, I would say, as you suggested, a massive rollout, a massive effort to build a lot more affordable public housing.
That's fair. I put you right on the spot and you responded.
No, I'm
So
happy to be
thank you.
put on the spot. And
Thank you for
yeah.
playing along. Yeah, it's just sometimes my frustration. You give somebody a pick and choose menu, and when they're not synced up, for example, the zoning restrictions lifted without counteracting, a financing cycle that's very poor for doing that development.
And we're seeing that here. By the way, to
Yes.
back you up on that, I've heard that from builders here who say we finally got, like, the city of Victoria was a little ahead the province of British Columbia, and they made a fairly big thing of, well, we've now allowed missing middle housing of fourplexes. And the builders are saying, we can't make this work all of a sudden. Maybe 10 years ago, yeah, but now we can't make it work. Now we're turning to 6-story market rental apartments because the missing middle, they're all happy to, they say they've created, actually doesn't pencil out in real life.
Right. So maybe it's more about coupling the measures in a way that makes sense. So do not talk about immigration on its own. It is not the immigrants' fault at all. It is the building of Canada that has relied on this beautiful influx of people from around the world. But link it. Maybe it's time to say these targets make sense for permanent, temporary, and student numbers. Because this is what we have on tap for housing, so I think that linkage, another linkage might make sense if this zoning change will be accompanied by an expansion of this federal or provincial financing program for builders and individuals taking advantage of this change. So, a little bit more of that, maybe we can ask from our, politicians and say, on its own, is this going to be enough? And that leads me to my my most controversial question.
Okay. All right. Here goes.
Our final most controversial question. Is this a Canadian housing crisis problem? Or is this a problem because of the domino nature of housing, where one segment gets priced out, they try to go out to and your book shows this beautifully, they go out to the further areas, of their province. They can't afford that. They go over to another province, and so forth and so on. So is this a national problem? Or is this a problem in which if the federal government was very serious about partnering with, let's say, two cities, Toronto and Vancouver, about a historic three-party government plan, the same way in Toronto they did on the waterfront, hopefully faster than that's taking. But to say, okay, we're in for this amount of housing, these amount of loans, this amount of building for the city of Toronto, for the city of Vancouver, rather than having our Mayor Olivia Chow in Toronto submitting plans to Housing Minister Sean Fraser, along with other municipalities, and not being recognized as being different. And the reason I say this is most of the immigration and even the students come to these two cities eventually. Even though a lot of studies show that, immigrants are first coming to many cities because of networking and you have your family, and it's totally understandable. These are the areas in which population growth takes place.
Yeah.
When these places boom and become overpriced, we then go out to all the, in Toronto area now is about 4 hours away, crunching all those local populations whose incomes are not Toronto incomes. Then those Ontarians take their money to the East Coast, and we displace people that are in the East Coast, and so forth. And I'm sure Vancouver to Calgary, there must be some concern about that flow. So it's not very Canadian for the federal government to focus on the geography of a national problem. But I do wonder, whether that taboo hurts us a little bit, whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do, and I know that politicians will be sensitive. I mean, they don't want to. I mean, probably anytime you're seen to be favoring Toronto outside of the GTA is kind of a political kiss of death.
No, it is a kiss
But
of
I
death.
but I actually think the numbers. I mean, even if it was just proportional, the numbers could be a huge ramp up in those two cities. And so, I mean, I think there's definitely. I mean, there's an incredibly strong case for the federal government taking a more active role in construction in those two cities and financing, as I think you're suggesting, if I hear you correctly.
Yeah.
Whether I guess the debate might be more whether it should exclude other places. So, for instance, I mean, they're going to hear about it. I mean, Halifax, and I take your point about how it displaces. It's astonishing to me what's happened in Nova Scotia. I mean, what was such a relatively affordable place, and so many towns, not just Halifax, towns all over Nova Scotia, have been displaced. And one of the big factors is people leaving Ontario during the pandemic, which includes friends of mine. And this is not a judgment or an indictment of people making understandable moves for economic reasons and family reasons or economic opportunities. But let's be honest, it's happened. I mean, there has been a spillover, and as you say, Toronto and Vancouver are the primary draws, and of course Montreal is in another way as well. So I could see why they would focus on it. But I guess I wonder. The question is, should they stop there, or should they keep going? But should our federal government do more in our biggest cities? I think the answer is unequivocally yes.
Yeah, I think they shouldn't shy away from what Olivia Chow in Toronto is calling for, which is a special historic agreement of 3 levels of government. The provinces joined. They need to do a little more. We're waiting on the feds. It's just, I think, concerning to me that this very typical election concern might actually be getting in the way. The election concern being, do you do something special for one part of Canada, not another?
Yeah.
And you're always balancing that calculus. And I appreciate that. That's part of being a representative government. But my only concern is that maybe we'll never actually solve the issue, and because you would need a great comms team to explain that fixing the problem here will relieve the pressure in the East Coast. It will relieve the pressure in other parts of Ontario, quite frankly. This phenomenon has really knocked other markets in Ontario out of whack. So outside of Toronto area. So, you would need to have the communication skills of, I don't know, of the
I
highest
know.
order.
I
And
know, and that shows how politics can often be the problem because I mean it makes good sense, and we see the same thing here in Vancouver. A spillover. I mean, I've had so many neighbors here on Vancouver Island who basically just said in the last 10 years, forget it, we're giving up on Vancouver. They come over, as I did 20 years ago. Don't get me wrong. Again, I'm not blaming people, but they come over and they can finally afford a house in Victoria. Meanwhile, one of the two parents is commuting every week or every couple of days across the water in a float plane or a ferry to Vancouver, and the prices start going up here as well, and then it happens up island, and so it happens across the country. And you're right, Toronto and Vancouver, if you addressed it at the source, as it were, I think it would really have a knock-on effect. It would. But selling that, yeah, you're right.
oof.
You're right.
Well, oh, the new Canadian dream, a 2-hour float plane commute.
I
Wow.
know. Yeah, it's pretty scenic, I have to say. I mean, it's pretty nice.
I
Yeah,
mean, that's
downtown to downtown, but
that sounds like one of the better dilemmas than the ones
that's true.
you've written about. And again, this absolutely marvelous book, Our Crumbling Foundation, on sale right now. Go to all your favorite booksellers. I'm going to buy this for my mom. I'm telling you, she's a good reader, but if you
Oh,
recommend
thanks,
something,
Urmi.
yeah, if you recommend something that she thinks wasted her time, she's not pleased.
Okay.
So I'm
Well, pressure's
confident.
on. I
Yes.
hope she likes
No,
it.
I
Yeah.
know she will. And I cannot congratulate you enough on this tremendous book. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us about it here.
My pleasure, Urmi. I've been enjoying watching your past podcasts, and it was really great to talk to you. Thank you for such an interesting conversation.
Thank you. That's so kind. And thanks to all of our viewers, and we'll talk to you soon on the same channel.